Whatever device you're watching this on right now, your phone, your laptop, doesn't matter. It simply would not exist without an invention that was born out of a massive looming crisis. This is the story of how one tiny spark inside a tiny crystal literally ignited our entire digital world. So to really understand this revolution, we first have to get a handle on the old way of doing things. Back in the 1940s, everything electronic ran on these things called vacuum tubes. They were the absolute kings of computing and communication, but they had a deep, fundamental flaw. And that flaw was about to bring the modern world to a screeching halt. All right, I want you to just picture something for me. 30 tons, okay? That's about the weight of 5 adult elephants. Now, what on earth could weigh that much and still be considered a piece of cutting-edge technology? Okay, now let's add another number to that 30 tons. Almost 18,000 of these fragile, glowing glass bulbs, and every single one of them was a potential point of failure, burning incredibly hot and just sucking down enormous amounts of power. This was the problem. Everybody, meet ENIAC, the electronic leviathan of 1946. For its time, it was the most powerful thinking machine on the planet. It could do calculations in seconds that would take a human mathematician days. But it was also a technological dead end. It was way too big, too hot, too hungry for power, and with thousands of those tubes, it was constantly breaking down. This wasn't the future, this was a massive roadblock. And you have to understand, this wasn't just some abstract engineering puzzle. The limits of the vacuum tube were actively pushing two of the world's most powerful systems right to the edge of a cliff.
First, there was the civilian crisis. Over at Bell Labs, the folks in charge could see the writing on the wall. After the war, America was making phone calls like never before. Demand for service was absolutely exploding. But their entire system, the whole thing, ran on millions and millions of vacuum tubes. The network was becoming totally unmanageable.
And the math was simple, and it was brutal. As the number of tubes they needed shot through the roof, the overall reliability of the system just plummeted. I mean, the entire telephone network was getting dangerously close to a point where it would spend more time being repaired than it would actually working. They needed a replacement, and they needed it yesterday. Then you had the military crisis. The Cold War was just beginning, and military planners knew that the next war wouldn't just be won with bombs, but with calculations. Things like designing nuclear weapons, plotting missile trajectories, these things needed computing power on a scale that was totally impossible with fragile, unreliable vacuum tubes. The nation that could compute the fastest would have the ultimate edge. So the world basically needed a miracle. And that solution wasn't going to come from making a slightly better, slightly smaller vacuum tube. No, it would come from a completely different part of science, from looking at the very building blocks of matter itself. Let's just reframe the problem for a second. What if you could do the job of a vacuum tube, but without the vacuum, without the delicate glass, without the glowing hot filament? What if you could figure out how to control electricity inside a solid object? Like a smarter rock? And it turns out 3 really important things came together to make this possible. First, you have quantum theory, which finally let us understand how electrons actually behave inside materials like silicon. Second, scientists figured out how to control the purity of these materials to an insane degree, which meant they could add tiny, precise impurities, a process called doping. And third, you had a whole new generation of scientists who were comfortable with both the high-minded theory and the hands-on tinkering. And all of that led to this moment at Bell Labs on December 16th, 1947. And just look at this thing. It's so crude, it's almost funny, right? A little slice of germanium, a plastic triangle, and 2 super thin gold contacts. A team of scientists took this contraption and fed a really weak electrical signal into one side of it. And this is the magic moment. The signal came out the other side, amplified. As they put it, the signal emerged from the other contacts significantly stronger. For the very first time, someone had achieved controlled amplification in a solid-state device. No heat, no vacuum, just a tiny spark of genius in a crystal. The transistor was born. Now, you'd think the world would just stop and cheer, right? That this would be front-page news everywhere. But the journey from this lab bench to your living room, well, it was surprisingly slow and really quiet at first. The public reaction was, well, pretty much a shrug. When Bell Labs announced the transistor in 1948, the New York Times buried the story on page 46, right next to the radio listings. Meanwhile, one of the inventors, William Shockley, supposedly said, "We've built a monster." They knew exactly what they had unleashed, even if nobody else had a clue yet.
I mean, the gap between that tiny news brief and the world it would eventually create is just immense. So, how did we go from a scientific curiosity to the foundation of, well, everything? The potential was there, but to really kick off the revolution, the transistor needed to get out of the lab and into people's hands. It needed a killer app.
And here it is. In 1954, this small company called Regency Electronics created that first killer app, the Regency TR1. It used just 4 transistors, and it was the world's first pocket radio. For the first time, electronics were no longer chained to a wall socket. They were portable. They were personal. This was a huge deal.
But the real transformation actually came from overseas. A company you've probably heard of, Sony, they licensed the technology. But they didn't just copy it, they perfected it. They developed all these mass production techniques that made transistors way cheaper, much more reliable, and a lot smaller. Their TR-55 radio in 1955 basically set a new global standard for what miniature electronics could be. You see, the success of the transistor radio did a lot more than just let teenagers listen to rock and roll at the beach. It proved the technology worked, it created a massive market, and it built the manufacturing foundation for every single thing that was about to come.
A good way to think of it is like this. 1947 was the spark, but 1954, that's when the fire really caught hold. These 2 moments, the lab breakthrough and that first wave of consumer products, were basically the starting pistol for the entire digital age. And from there, it's like the branches of a tree just exploded outwards. The techniques they used to make transistors led directly to the integrated circuit, which then led to personal computers. The new reliability made global communications through satellites actually possible. It all connects back, leading straight to the digital world we're all living in today. And this, right here, is the most crucial point of the whole story. The transistor took electronics out of the hands of governments and giant corporations and put it into the hands of ordinary people. It turned technology from a massive room-sized machine into a personal tool that fits in your pocket.
And that brings us right back to that haunting quote from Shockley. "We've built a monster." It's almost chilling, isn't it? Even then, right at the very beginning, the inventors could sense the incredible, world-altering power they had just created, a power that continues to reshape our world in ways that couldn't possibly have imagined.
So, the spark in a crystal gave us the modern age. It solved the huge crises of its time and built a completely new world, which leaves us with one last thought. What seemingly small breakthrough happening in some labs somewhere today is going to be the foundation for the world of tomorrow?